be collaborating on this and not competing.
Mila Buikas. Thank you very much for that, Russell. Really interesting and really detailed. I'm sure there's a lot there for our members to get their teeth into, so to speak. So from talking about, I suppose, the more scholarly approach to genealogies and a listing of not all the genealogies, but a good part of them, we're now going to move on to our board member, Rob O'Halloran, who will speak about his own research into the O'Halloran lineage of Northeast Clare, the Slieve Aughty region, and how one can, I suppose, in a more practical sense, advance the research both specifically into a family, but also into a wider sort of king group, a clan, a lineage. So without any further ado, over to you, Rob.
That's great. Thanks, Luke. So just to give you a summary of my journey into all of this. So I began researching the O'Hallorans about 7 or 8 years ago. My dad was originally from Cork City, and I was tracing the family line back. I got as far as the 1820s, 1830s, where I found the O'Hallorans living in the Cork Harbour area. But like many people researching their Irish heritage, I hit a brick wall, and that's because there is that gap that was touched on earlier by Russell. There is a gap in the record, and particularly in terms of family records between the mid 17th century and the early part of the 19th century. So I started to get interested in the O'Hallorans further back in time. I was aware of 2 lineages of the same name, one set of O'Hallorans from County Galway, and they are linked to the O'Flahertys and were based originally around the Loch Corrib area. Quite a significant family. And I figured that most people would be, who were O'Halloran of surname, would be linked to the Galway O'Hallorans. The other branch, entirely separate family, the other branch though was from County Clare. And here I found the works of Patrick Wolfe and Edward MacLysett, their respective books on Irish surnames, really invaluable to give me an overview of those two different families. But really beyond this, my knowledge of the O'Hallorans was pretty much zero. I decided to do a wide DNA test, and I was surprised to find out that I'm a Dalcassian. So my origins, family origins, are amongst the O'Hallorans of County Clare. So I started to research these O'Hallorans in Thomond, as it was then, but because they weren't a sizable or significant lineage, there was a real lack of primary source material on them. So what I had to do was go about piecing together a bit of a jigsaw puzzle of material to start to build a picture of these O'Hallorans in Thomond. What I found was that the first mention of them was in the mid 14th century saga narrative, the Chants of Turlough. And this is a colourful, it's a very bombastic account of a dynastic dispute, essentially, between rival branches of the O'Brien family for overlordship in Thomond. But the O'Hallorans, amongst a number of other lineages, are referenced several times, and they appear as client vassals in the McNamara lordship of Clan Cullin, and this is the eastern section of County Clare. The Chants of Turlough was useful on a number of levels. One of the things it helped me to do was place the O'Hallorans in context. So at one point in that work, there is, I believe it's a poem which lists out a number of different lineages in order of precedence. The O'Hallorans appear roughly around mid-table in that list. They're behind far more illustrious lineages such as the McInnerneys. I was able to take that information and much as Russell has just described, in fact, I cross-referenced this with the Book of Munster, and the O'Hallorans are referenced here. They're referenced in close kinship with the McNamaras, but they occupy a much more a junior line of descent. So clearly they were close kinsmen, but it was a very unequal relationship between those two lineages. I started then moving into the primary sources to see what I could find about the family and what they did, whether they had a particular role or held a particular service function within the lordship of Clan Cullen. I started to look through the papal registers, which are available online. They're a fantastic resource, although spellings can sometimes be a little bit wayward. I found references to the O'Hallorans in there, but to be honest, they were fairly sporadic, and the impression I got from the registers was that they were not a clerical family per se, nor are they referenced as any kind of literary family or indeed hereditary service office holders of another type. So they weren't physicians, they weren't Brehon lawyers, for example. What I did manage to find, however, that they were landholders of some importance in a local context in East Clare. And the most important piece of evidence, and again a primary source, the most important piece of evidence for this was the so-called McNamara rental, which is a mid-14th century list of tributes on a series of land denominations in East Clare. And this references the O'Hallorans' primary landholding in the Slieve-Orty uplands, as Luke mentioned. And this is right on the northern frontier of Thomond, and today it sits on the Clare-Galway border. The district that's mentioned in the McNamara rental is Faha I Alwaran, so O'Halloran's Green, and over time this name has been compressed, it's been contracted down to Fahi, and today it's known as the townland of Faha, and that's in the barony of Tulla Upper. And this is, as I say, very much a border zone location, and various academics have written about the importance of border zone locations in Gaelic Irish lordships. Most importantly, Porrick O'Rian wrote about this back in the 1970s. And really the impression I got from finding all of this out was that perhaps the O'Hallorans up there held some kind of strategic importance as local level marcher lords. I started to study the maps. We've mentioned already this morning the Ordnance Survey maps from the 19th century. They were invaluable in gleaning further information on this part of Thomond. I noticed that in Fahi there were the remains of a church that's stone built, and architectural evidence suggests that it's 15th century in origin. And nearby is a Balawn stone, a holy well, and I managed to visit the site really to get an understanding of how these features related to one another and how they're set in the context of the landscape. And the impression I got from this, I mean, it was invaluable to see the site. The impression I got was it was a site of some local ecclesiastical importance. And indeed, it features in the National Folklore Collection, which is another invaluable resource. It's again available online, much of it from the 1920s and 30s. And there's a reference in there to the Holy Well of Fahi, and it calls it St. Anne's Well and refers to it as a cure for eye conditions. And so I started to draw together these various different elements of the story, these different disparate pieces of evidence. And I started to wonder whether in holding these church lands in Fahi, that in fact the O'Hallorans might be an Urnar family, although they aren't anywhere recorded as such. Final thing that I'll mention, and perhaps the most unusual thing I encountered in researching the lineage, was that this land in Fahy, this church land, was held by the O'Halloran's not from the Diocese of Killaloe, in which it's located, but in fact from the neighbouring diocese of Kilmacduagh. And this is referenced in a royal visitation record from 1615 that Kenneth Nichols has published an article on, again, a number of years ago. He conjectures that because the borders of the Diocese of Kilmacduagh are coterminous with the borders of the former kingdom of Ifiacrac Eidna, that in fact this was a vestige or some kind of remnant of a prior period of dominance. And so the situation at Fahy is unusual, a cross-border situation, but it might hark back to a prior period of dominance under the Ifiacrac Eidna. So my conclusion, and I wrote this up in a paper, my conclusion was that the O'Hallorans were a small but quite successful lineage. I did caveat this though with the thought that their status was in part dependent on holding this strategically important and perhaps ecclesiastically important section of land up at Fahy. Once they lost that land holding in the early part of the 17th century, and by the time of the books of survey and distribution, it was in the hands of the O'Briens. By the time they lost that land holding, the impression I got was that their significance had reduced as a result. So that's a quick canter through on researching the O'Hallorans. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Really useful and really interesting overview there of, I suppose, a clan-specific study, shall we say. And going back to those early sources, you mentioned the Cahram Hurlig, or the wars of the triumphs of Turlough from perhaps the mid-14th century, written possibly by the McGraths, and using that sort of those medieval sources and then bringing forward into the 17th century books of distribution and survey. There's a lot of administrative sources emanating from the English Central Authority here in Ireland from the 17th century, confiscations and so forth during that turbulent century, but which rather fortuitously means that we actually have records in which to hook these families into. I certainly know from my own genealogical research, and like many people, would be able to throw their own line back maybe to the mid-19th century. At the outset of Russell's lecture, he gave his own Shenachus, his own genealogy, possibly hooking it on to the Griffith evaluation of the 1850s. If one is lucky enough, maybe the family appear in the 1820s Tytha Plotman books, for example. And we find a lot of these sources now uploaded and transcribed on county library websites. Certainly the Clare Library website is fantastic for that information if people have Clare roots, but Tipperary as well, and other places around the country, and a lot of these are published. But the real difficulty, particularly if the family were of a middling or a lower family, perhaps tenant farmers, and especially if they were Roman Catholic, is to link from the 1820s back to a period prior to the penal laws. Yeah. So this is prior to the early 1700s. And really even prior to the Williamite confiscations of the 1690s. That is often really difficult, that the sort of the long 18th century, and finding sources of relevance. Perhaps you could speak to us a little bit about how you bridge that gap, or indeed if one can bridge that gap, and if one cannot, what are other ways around, what are proxy records that one can use in order to go back to a period where there are more records, such as the 17th and 16th century.
That's great. Thanks, Luke. I mean, there's a wealth of information online now. I alluded to some of the sources in my remarks. I mean, there are proxy sources as well. So Trinity College runs the depositions website. After a number of upheavals during the 17th century, there were legal processes to seek redress for damage, particularly to Protestant landholders, and a number of traditional Catholic families are identified in those records. Again, the spellings can be a little bit wayward, but that's a useful proxy source. Another one, and this, apologies, it's Clare-centric again, but you do get a bit of a trend of antiquarians, particularly in the late 18th and early 19th century, compiling records that unfortunately were subsequently lost in the Four Courts fire in 1922. We're fortunate in Clare to have, for example, the work of James Frost, who summarised a whole series of inquisitions and other deeds which contain a wealth of information. In many ways, it's tantalizing because they are summaries, not full transcriptions. So you get a partial view. But I would say it's difficult to trace a personal line back that far, not being from a particularly illustrious or overly landed family. There is that gap in the record. And so I sought instead to look at the lineage as a whole and the clusters in particular of landholders. You know, we weren't hereditary office holders. There isn't that written record in that respect. But where we did hold land as O'Halloran's and it was subsequently lost, as you say, Luke, there is a record of that. And that can form a useful guide as to where your origins might be.
Thank you for that. And I think it's worthwhile just maybe drilling down on some of those other records. So I think you alluded to the folklore collection. So this was a collection that was done in the 1930s. School children essentially were charged with the duty of going out and speaking to their grandparents and older members of the community right through Ireland. So a lot of those have been transcribed. Some are Oscuelga, some are in Irish. Vast majority, I think, are in English. And it's replete with information. It's a huge corpus of material. As I understand it, it's over 100,000 pages. I think it's extraordinary effort. And it can be accessed now at www.duchus.ie. So really useful. And at least I suppose it points one into the direction of traditional beliefs. Perhaps that bull on stone was mentioned there. But also, so that's for the 1930s, but actually the collective memory would throw one back to possibly even pre-famine times, pre-1840s, but well into the 19th century as well. And I think also the importance of place names. You mentioned I suppose the efficacy of just using the Ordnance Survey maps. These are the 1840s maps onwards, but understanding or having a cognizance of place names I think is imperative. You might talk us to a little bit about perhaps place name analysis and how that's been important for, at least for the O'Hallorans.
Indeed, I think this was the one area where I felt fortunate in that there was a distinct townland that had a name based on the O'Halloran surname. And I know that's not totally unusual. In the paper that I wrote, I found a couple of other examples linked to this idea of faha, so the green area around a chiefly residence or a fort. So there are occasions, particularly in land records, where a surname is called out. There's another. And Luke, you might have to help me here. There's another website where it calls up. It's almost a chronology of.
Loganum.
Yes, Loganum. Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic because that told me. I mean, I started off with the townland of Faha, and I could move all the way back to, as I say, the McNamara rental. Where it's spelt out the denomination in full, Faha I Alran, and really go from there. So, you know, sometimes it's pot luck. Other times the name reveals itself and can be a useful guide. I would just say on that theme, sometimes with a surname like O'Halloran, sometimes you need a little bit of luck where you're otherwise an undistinguished family.
I wouldn't say that, Rob. But I think to your point there, place names and more generally onomastics, you know, the study of names is another tool which we can bring to bear on trying to understand the sources of Irish surnames and indeed our own patrilineal descent. one thing that brings to mind is Island McGrath, for example, just south of Ennis, Elon Vacra, the island of the McGrath family, and they held the hereditary abbacy of Clare Abbey during the 15th century. So you had this real tie-up between a localized place name and the actual family themselves, and then in some circumstances, we can ascertain them in the historical record of holding an office. In that context, it was the office of the abbot of Clare Abbey. But it's very useful from your own perspective, also going back to the McNamara rental of 14th century and being able to ascertain a place name directly connected to your own people, your own family. But I think also topography is important. So your family from northeast Clare, Tulla, Upper Barony, the Slieve Aughty ranges, relatively marginal. And if you look at the place names, there might be references to bogs, to woods, and so forth like that. I think that's quite important to understand the agricultural, topographical context in which the clan held their lands. So that can also be useful when people are researching family history, of understanding that wider context, even if you can't actually drill down into your own family itself. That wider context can help research forward somewhat. I'd also just put into the mix here other documents for that long 18th century. Yes. So things like the convert rolls. So these are lists of Catholics who become Protestant under the pressure of the penal laws from during the 1700s, so the 18th century. And we find that sort of goes in certain waves, particularly when the penal laws were quite harshly enforced, if we can put it like that, in the 1710s, 1720s into the 1730s. We find quite a lot of lists of individuals island-wide. Yeah. Then it sort of goes into a bit of a hiatus, and it comes back in the 1760s and so on. That's quite useful as well, particularly for those individuals who probably were already sort of middling Roman Catholics, middle class, who, because of the advantages of being members of the established church, decide to convert at that stage as well. And of course, there's estate records. At least in the County Clare context, we have the Inchiquin manuscripts, which are replete of information in the 18th, but also 17th and even 16th century as well. And also, not to forget, parish records and gravestone inscriptions. And as you mentioned, in terms of your own people, there was some built heritage there. So this sort of stone church, possibly of the 15th century. Yeah. You might talk to us about the importance of visiting sites and sort of touching the old sod, so to speak. I'm quite cognizant myself, and yourself as well, being members of the diaspora, the importance when one does research from afar. It is quite difficult sometimes to access sources. Now, we have spoken, and Russell has touched on Irish Script on Screen, which is a fantastic resource for looking at genealogical manuscripts and other manuscripts besides that one can do online. And there's increasingly more things online. And I direct people to the Clans of Ireland website under our historical sources page in that regard. But nothing beats, surely, getting out into the field, getting the wellies dirty, and actually visiting those sites and getting a real sense of being grounded in those sites. So you might talk to us a little bit about that, please.
I will do so. So in the context of the site I mentioned, Fahy, up in the Slieve Aughties, it's a fascinating site. What I hadn't appreciated in reading about that low set of, I mean, they're called mountains, but I guess they're a low set of hills. I'd read that it was a rugged environment. It was quite inhospitable. It's not somewhere in my mind's eye. It wasn't a sort of a particularly fertile or lush part of County Clare. But what I found in visiting the site is there is a section almost on the border with Galway, which is in fact very, very good agricultural land. And the thing that I had struggled with was what was the importance of this land holding? Why was it sought after? Why were the O'Halloran's eventually displaced? And actually, it began to make sense that amidst an otherwise slightly rugged terrain, this fertile tract of land would have been economically important, given the basis of The economy and society then was cattle and grazing. So it would have had an economic aspect to it, as well as a strategic aspect. And if you add into the mix this ecclesiastical site as well, it's only when visiting and seeing all of that and the interlinkages between all of those different elements, which you wouldn't get from looking at a map, the topography, as you say, Luke, that you can start to draw some hard and fast conclusions. So yes, touching the old sod, as you put it, is highly recommended.
Thanks. And I think the operative word is interlinkages. I think if there's anything in terms of a takeaway from today's talk from both of our esteemed guests, is the importance of just bringing everything together, you know, and looking at all different sources. So we have the scholarly sources, we have the ancient, if we want to term them like that, genealogies, we have narrative sources from the later medieval period, then we have the English or colonial administrative records. We have then the church sources such as parish records, gravestones, and so on and so forth. We have the local folklore, the 1930s collection. So there's a lot there, actually. Even if one can't bridge that 18th century gap, or it's very difficult, it's certainly well worthwhile doing that more general history. It's really, I suppose, enriching. You've written also, you mentioned you've published on the O'Hallorans, and I believe certainly you had an article in the 2021 anthology of the Clans of Ireland. So if anybody is listening and would like a copy of that, please go to the Wordwell website under Gaelic Ireland. It was published in 2021, and I certainly recommend it to everyone here today. But what sort of got you into doing that research and writing it up? Was there a certain point or a certain critical mass of documentary evidence that you had essentially assimilated in your mind, and then you decide to write it up? I'm thinking that we'll have a lot of members out there who are thinking, who've done that journey as you have, and are on perhaps the cusp of wanting to publish something, but just not quite sure how to begin. Perhaps you might talk to us a little bit about that.
So I'm going to give you a shameless plug here. I put all of this together just purely out of interest, and I saw, and here's the shameless plug, I saw an advert for the essay competition. And I forget where I saw it, maybe in Irish Ancestors or one of the sort of genealogy magazines. And the deadline was probably 6 months from that point. So, and it had a cash prize. So I thought, why not? So I'd half written it up. I thought, why not go? I did a history degree quite a long time ago, just at BA level. So I was a little bit rusty, but I thought, I've always been interested. I'd like to give it a whirl. And it was brilliant, because it went from having a slightly disparate collection of information, thoughts, sources, and it was a way to bring it all together. So actually, for me, it was that was the kind of turning point, and I submitted it, and I was delighted to be included in the anthology. So that was the tipping point for me. And that competition obviously runs yearly. There are other competitions and other ways in, but for me, it was having a sort of formal process actually that turned me from just someone sort of in my spare time doing this into something a bit more active and engaged. So there you go, positive plug.
Thank you for that. Yes, indeed, I think that's quite a good catalyst for a lot of people, and sort of as a way in, as you mentioned. And how have you found sort of dealing, again, as a member of the diaspora, dealing with particularly Irish language sources, or perhaps Latin sources, or just getting your head around some of the place names, albeit even in anglicised form? You might speak to us a little bit about those sort of challenges and overcoming those hurdles, and how it can, once one overcomes them, how a whole body of new evidence can open up to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, the language, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, as I say, my dad's from Cork, but I didn't grow up in any kind of Irish language speaking household, so I felt at a distinct disadvantage when coming to this. I'm reminded of something Russell said in his talk about some of the source information follows a certain pattern, and that in tuning into patterns, or certain things are done on rote, and actually once you're able to crack the code, as it were, even with minimal Latin or Irish, you begin to unlock quite a lot of information. There is, of course, a higher level of detail that remains beyond you. But for me, and really in the spare time trying to glean a little bit of knowledge here and there of particularly Irish language. It's been tricky, but I found at a lower level there is a great deal that you can do quite easily. And again, Luke, I'm going to lean on you for the source, but there's the online dictionary, EDIL, which is that's really, really useful for some of the Middle and Old Irish stuff. Words that's fantastic for unlocking meaning. So far from an expert, I can't even order a cup of coffee, but for some sources, genealogies in particular, I can have a crack.
Yeah, and I think also quite a lot of these sources are translated. There is still a lacuna in terms of some of the great genealogical compilations, and of course the Clans of Ireland have our own project of transcribing and publishing Linear Antiqua, which will be well known to our members, which we announced that project last year. But there is quite a lot of sources now translated or perhaps semi-translated, which can be leveraged for some of your other non-translated sources. And as you said, once you crack the code, as you elegantly put it, one can actually understand the sort of standard formula, particularly in the genealogies when it's son of, etc. But it's certainly, I think, worth the effort, putting in a little bit of time of getting at least a sense of the nominative vis-a-vis the genitive terms. That's going to be really important when looking at certainly Irish language sources and also obviously Latin sources as well. I might just bring into the discussion here, Russell. We've spoken about more, I suppose, post-17th century research and Irish sources, particularly looking at these kin groups, or as we term them in shorthand, clans. I was wondering, from a sort of medievalist perspective, what would be the ways that you could perhaps leverage some of the older genealogical compilations to help out with research? You did, through your talk today, reference some of the early formations of surnames, which are obviously extant within the genealogical tradition, but I'm just wondering how else you could leverage some of these older sources for a study of an Irish clan.
Well, there was a point made that you might find your own line, at least in terms of father to father to father, but you might be able to get the context of the wider group from where you come. And that, I think, if there's one take-home message, hopefully for people today, from my own talk, is that that you can use this material for exactly that. Hopefully, I managed to outline just kind of the potentials of what's there as opposed to anything else. But yeah, you can definitely do that, I think. And I mean, some of the names do pop up if you usually go maybe 2 or 3 generations back from the person at the head of the genealogy in the later genealogies for people who were maybe alive in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. Then sometimes you do find maybe some of these surnames. So that, again, there is maybe a code to be cracked there as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, absolutely. I think it's just to that point, that more sort of rounded research to contextualize families, if you can't do, as you mentioned, father to father and so forth. So maybe before we sort of wrap up, it might be worthwhile just talking about some of the secondary sources. We've talked a lot about primary sources, which is really the bread and butter of research, but let's not forget there are quite a lot of secondary sources which can help us delve further into the past, at least at a more perhaps superficial level, and direct one to primary sources when one has that sort of expertise. And back to you, maybe, Russell, in terms of books, and I'm sure you're a bibliophile as we all sitting here are indeed. In terms of books on medieval Ireland and perhaps also later medieval Ireland, what would be maybe a handful of ones that you could recommend?
So Paul McCotter's book, Medieval Ireland, he reconstructs the Ballybeatig. So when you were talking about your place name and the fact that there is probably a high producing agricultural unit within it, that might actually be in the core of something like so Ballybeatig or Ballybeatach is a food producing Ballia. Ballia has got a massive semantic range that we won't even go into here, but it's usually about can sometimes extend to maybe 3 or 4 townlands later on. And yeah, sometimes when you take the landscape context, then you get that. So Paul McCotter's done a fantastic job of reconstructing that and reconstructing the Tríocha system, which partially underlies the Cantredal system introduced in the Anglo-Norman period. So in terms of, because we mentioned place names, in terms of tying space to people, that book is absolutely straight off. That's the first one I would recommend. But of course, to really get the benefit from that book, which has just been reprinted by Four Courts Press in paperback, I believe. Well, at least I saw it in paperback yesterday in a bookshop. Yeah, engaging my bibliophilia. Stuff like the New History of Ireland volumes, they're period specific. So there's the Oxford New History of Ireland, and there's the Cambridge, I suppose you could call it the New History of Ireland. So each one of those volumes for from the period you're interested in, but you know, if you're interested in the medieval period, those are very, very good ones to get started. Beyond that, yeah, there's the general text of your Cronin's one, Stephen Ellis's, you know, there's the Longman New History of Ireland series as they were back then. So yeah, that's probably enough. That's already going to be a few hundred down the drain, or well, it's never down the drain, but a few out of the bank balance.
Yes, indeed. I think I'll just also add in, of course, Kenneth Nichols's Gaelic and Gaelicised Ireland. I think it originally was out in the early 70s and has been... That was in the Gill History of Ireland. That's right, yeah. Numerous reprints. You mentioned Dáithí O'Cronin's Early Medieval Ireland is certainly well worthwhile, and particularly for your own period, looking at the genealogies, the church schools, the scriptoria, sort of the political, cultural and economic context that underlay the latter period has its roots in the early period, obviously, and there's a real sense of continuity there. And I believe, Rob, you were recently reading Robin Flower's The Irish Tradition, which you seem to recommend.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Around sort of bardic poetry and the evolution of the bardic tradition. Very short, very to the point, beautifully written. So yeah, couldn't recommend it highly enough.
Yeah, I would also add the Royal Irish Academy's manuscript-specific volumes that are coming out. There's three out so far, one on Never the Hydra, one on the Book of Ballymote, and one on the Book of Vivania. And they just had the fourth conference that will eventually produce a book on, I think it was the Lower Brack. So keep an eye out for those. And then all those place names volumes that the Royal Irish Academy is bringing out, those are really essential for anyone who's working on families. So they're on the 7th volume, so they're up as far as F at this stage. Mm. So, you know, hopefully in my lifetime, they'll get as far as, well, where would you end the Irish alphabet, you know?
Indeed, I think that's the Locus project, which has been run out of University College Cork. And the last thing I'll put in there is obviously the catalogue lists. So the catalogue of Irish manuscripts, which was published by the Royal Irish Academy some decades ago, the Irish manuscripts which were found in the British Museum and are now in the British Library. That was also Flower, who was one of the editors of that. Really useful information for delving down in terms of what's actually in some of those manuscripts as well. A lot of this can seem intimidating up first, initially, but when one runs an eye through a catalogue, you do have that sort of breakdown in terms of what lies within these manuscripts, so that can be really useful, both in terms of names of the scribes of these manuscripts, but also in terms of place names and other things mentioned besides. And of course, the corpus of bardic poetry we touched on, which can also be accessed via a very simple Google search. Really useful information in the 2,500 remaining bardic poems, not just for Ireland, but also for Scotland as well. So I think that sort of concludes the scholarly aspect of today's presentations. So once again, I'd like to thank both of our speakers, Dr. Russell O'Riordan and Rob O'Halloran, very much for sharing their expertise with us today. And I now pass this over to Gerard O'Kellig, our Cuhelach, who will oversee the next aspect of today's discussion, which is, of course, the members' forum.
Thank you, Luke, very, very much. Okay.